Karina Tyler lived an ordinary life in a quiet suburban neighborhood. She had been married to Tolkien for 8 years, and they had 2 children, Alizé and John. From the outside, their life seemed perfect, an ideal family, living the American dream. But beneath the surface, Karina felt a deep dissatisfaction. The passion in her marriage had long faded, replaced by routine and monotony. Tolkien was a good man, but he was often distant, preoccupied with his demanding job and the pressures of being the breadwinner. It was during one of their family gatherings that Karina's life took a dark turn. Tolkien's younger brother Arfsten had recently returned to town after a messy divorce. He was charming, adventurous, and had a magnetic personality that Karina found impossible to resist, unlike Tolkien, who had become predictable. Arfsten was a breath of fresh air, exciting and dangerous. At first, it was just innocent flirting. Karina and Arfsten shared glances across the dinner table, exchanged playful banter, and found themselves drawn to each other in ways they had not expected. But what started as harmless fun soon spiraled into something much more intense. One night, after a family barbecue, Karina and Arfsten found themselves alone in the kitchen. The tension between them was palpable, and before they knew it, they were kissing passionately. The thrill of the forbidden moment consumed them, and they both knew there was no turning back. That kiss marked the beginning of a torrid affair, one that would have devastating consequences. The affair between Karina and Arfsten quickly escalated. They began meeting in secret, sneaking around whenever they could find a moment alone. Every stolen glance, every touch, ignited a fire in Karina that she hadn't felt in years. The excitement of being with Arfsten consumed her, and she found herself thinking about him, constantly craving the moments they could spend together. Arfsten, too, was intoxicated by the thrill of the affair. He had always been the black sheep of the family, never quite living up to Tolkien's success. Being with Karina felt like a way to get back at his older brother, to take something that Tolkien valued. It was a twisted form of revenge, but one that Arfsten relished. As the weeks went by, Karina became more reckless. She started lying to Tolkien about where she was going, making up excuses to see Arfsten. The more she deceived her husband, the easier it became. The guilt that had initially plagued her began to fade, replaced by a sense of invincibility. She was living a double life, one that was thrilling and dangerous, and she was addicted to the rush. But as careful as they tried to be, their affair didn't go unnoticed. Karina's best friend Karen began to suspect that something was going on. She noticed the way Karina looked at Arfsten, the way she always seemed distracted, and how she had become increasingly secretive. Karen was worried, but she didn't want to accuse Karina of anything without proof, so she decided to keep an eye on her friend, hoping that she was wrong. Meanwhile, Arfsten started to feel the pressure of their secret. He knew that if Tolkien ever found out, it would destroy their relationship and possibly tear the family apart, but he couldn't bring himself to end it with Karina. He was too deep in, and the thought of losing her was unbearable. The affair continued, growing more intense and more dangerous. With each passing day, Karina and Arfsten were playing a game of fire, and neither of them realized just how close they were to getting burned. Tolkien began to notice changes in Karina's behavior. She was more distant, always distracted, and seemed to be hiding something. Their conversations, once filled with warmth and laughter, had become strange and awkward. Tolkien was no fool. He could sense that something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it one evening. As Karina was preparing dinner, Tolkien decided to confront her. "Karina, is everything okay? You've been acting different lately." Karina froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been so careful to hide the affair, but now faced with Tolkien's concern, she felt a surge of panic. "Everything's fine, Tolkien," she replied, forcing a smile. "I've just been a little stressed. That's all." Tolkien wasn't convinced he knew Karina well enough to see through her facade, but he didn't want to push her instead. He decided to keep an eye on her to see if he could figure out what was really going on. Meanwhile, Karen's suspicions continued to grow. She had always been close to Karina, and the changes in her friend's behavior were too obvious to ignore. One afternoon, while they were having coffee, Karen decided to confront Karina. "Karina, is there something you need to tell me?" Karen asked gently. "You've been acting really strange lately, and I'm worried about you." Karina felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She hated lying to Karen, but she couldn't risk her friend finding out about the affair. "I'm fine, Karen," she said, trying to sound convincing. "I've just been dealing with some personal stuff. It's nothing serious." But Karen wasn't buying it. She knew Karina too well to be fooled by her lies, determined to find out the truth. Karen decided to take matters into her own hands. She started following Karina, watching her every move, hoping to catch her in the act. As Karen dug deeper, she discovered something that shocked her to her core. She spotted Karina and Arfsten together, their interactions far too intimate to be innocent. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Karina was having an affair with her brother-in-law. Karen was torn. She didn't want to betray her friend, but she couldn't stand by and watch Karina destroy her marriage. She knew she had to do something, but she wasn't sure. What should she confront Karina? Directly tell Tolkien the weight of the secret was crushing her, and she knew that whatever she decided, there would be no turning back, as Karen wrestled with her dilemma. Karina and Arfsten's affair grew increasingly dangerous. The thrill of their secret relationship had given way to paranoia and fear. They knew that they were playing with fire, and the consequences of getting caught could be catastrophic. One evening, after a heated argument with Karina, Arfsten found himself spiraling out of control. He was consumed by jealousy, anger, and fear, emotions that he had never been able to handle. Well, in a fit of rage, he decided to confront Tolkien to put an end to the charade. Once and for all, Arfsten showed up at Tolkien and Karina's house, unannounced, his heart pounding, with a mix of adrenaline and dread. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he knew that he couldn't keep living this lie. As he approached the door, he saw Tolkien sitting in the living room, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. But before Arfsten could make his presence known, he was struck by a sudden chilling thought. If he confessed, if he told Tolkien everything, it would destroy not only Tolkien's life, but his own as well. He would lose everything. His brother, his family, and Karina, consumed by desperation. Arfsten made a split-second decision. He couldn't let the truth come out. He couldn't lose Karina, and he couldn't face the consequences of his actions. There was only one way out. With shaking hands, Arfsten grabbed a heavy candlestick from the hallway and entered the living room. Tolkien looked up surprised to see his brother Arfsten. "What are you doing here?" Before Tolkien could react, Arfsten swung the candlestick with all his might. The blow landed with a sickening thud, and D.V. Avid collapsed to the floor, blood pooling around his head. Arfsten stood over his brother's lifeless body, the reality of what he had done slowly sinking in. He had just killed his own brother. Panic set in as Arfsten realized the gravity of his actions. He had killed Tolkien in a moment of rage, and now he had to deal with the aftermath. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do next. He knew he had to cover his tracks to make sure that no one would ever suspect him of the murder. Arfston quickly wiped down the candlestick, removing any fingerprints that could tie him to the crime. He then staged the scene to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. He ransacked the house, breaking a window and scattering items around the living room to create the illusion of a struggle. As he worked, Arfston's thoughts turned to Karina. What would she do when she found out? How would she react? He knew that she would be devastated, but he also knew that she would do whatever it took to protect their secret. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not. When Karina returned home later that night, she was greeted by a scene of horror. The house was in disarray, and Tolkien's lifeless body lay in a pool of blood in the living room. She screamed, dropping her bags and rushing to his side. But it was too late. Tolkien was gone, in a state of shock. Karina called the police, her mind reeling from the trauma of what she had just witnessed. She had no idea that Arfston was responsible, no inkling that the man she had been having an affair with had just murdered her husband. The police arrived quickly, and the investigation began. They questioned Karina, but she had no answers for them. She was too distraught, too overwhelmed to think clearly. All she could do was cry, her mind racing with grief and confusion. Arfston, on the other hand, played the role of the concerned brother perfectly. He arrived at the house shortly after the police, feigning shock and disbelief at the sight of his brother's body. He calmed Karina, holding her, as she wept all the while, knowing that he was the one responsible for her pain. But as the investigation continued, the pressure began to mount. The police were thorough, and they weren't convinced that the scene was as it appeared. They found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, and no clear motive for a robbery. As the days passed, Arfston and Karina found themselves trapped in a web of lies and deceit. They knew that the truth could come out at any moment, and the fear of being caught consumed them both. The weight of their secret was crushing, and they were slowly being suffocated by the guilt and paranoia that haunted them as the investigation dragged on. The tension between Karina and Arfston grew unbearable. The guilt of Tolkien's murder hung over them like a dark cloud, and the fear of being caught gnawed at their sanity. They were trapped in a nightmare of their own making, and there seemed to be no way out. Karen, still suspicious of Karina's behavior, continued to dig deeper into her friend's life. She was convinced that Karina was hiding something, and she was determined to find out what it was. She began to investigate on her own, piecing together clues that the police had overlooked one evening while going through Tolkien's belongings. Karen stumbled upon something that sent chills down her spine. A series of emails between Karina and Arfston. The messages were explicit, detailing their affair and their plans to meet in secret. Karen's heart raced as she read through the emails, realizing the full extent of Karina's betrayal. But as she dug deeper, Karen uncovered something even more disturbing. An email from Arfston, sent just hours before Tolkien's murder. In the message, Arfston hinted at taking drastic measures to protect their secret, even if it meant resorting to violence. Karen's blood ran cold. She knew that she had to confront Karina, to force her to come clean. But as she prepared to confront her friend, she made a fatal mistake. She told Arfston what she had found. Realizing that Karen knew too much, Arfston panicked. He couldn't let her go to the police, couldn't let her destroy everything he had done to cover up his crime. There was only one option left. Late that night, Arfston broke into Karen's house. He found her in the living room, clutching the printouts of the email she had discovered. She looked up startled as Arfston approached her. "Arfston, what are you doing here?" Karen asked, fear creeping into her voice. I'm sorry, Karen, Arfston whispered, his voice trembling. But you've left me no choice. Before Karen could react, Arfston lunged at her, his hands closing around her throat. Karen fought back, clawing at his hands, but Arfston was too strong. Within moments, Karen's struggles weakened, and she collapsed to the floor, lifeless. Arfston stood over her body, gasping for breath. He had just killed again, and this time there was no turning back. The walls were closing in, and the only thing he could do now was to keep running, to keep covering his tracks, until there was nothing left to uncover, with Karen dead. Arfston believed he had bought himself some time. He went to great lengths to make her death appear as a tragic accident. But the guilt of his actions began to consume him. He couldn't escape the weight of what he had done, and it was starting to show. His once confident and charismatic demeanor was replaced by paranoia and anxiety. Karina, unaware of Karen's discovery and subsequent murder, was still struggling to cope with Tolkien's death. She had been living in a fog of grief, trying to hold herself together for the sake of her children. But something was gnawing at her, a feeling that something wasn't right. One day, as she was going through Tolkien's old emails, she stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. It was a message from Karen, sent just before her death, detailing her suspicions about Karina's affair with Arfston and her belief that Arfston had murdered Tolkien. Karina's heart pounded as she read the email. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, and she realized the horrifying truth. Arfston had killed Tolkien, and he had killed Karen to cover it up. The man she had been having an affair with, the man she had thought she loved, was a cold-blooded killer. Terrified, Karina knew she had to act quickly. She couldn't let Arfston get away with what he had done, but she also knew that she couldn't confront him directly. He was dangerous, unpredictable, and she feared for her own life and the lives of her children. Karina began to gather evidence just as Karen had. She took screenshots of the emails, recorded phone conversations, and started keeping a journal of everything she knew. She needed to have enough proof to take to the police to ensure that Arfston would be arrested and held accountable for his crimes. But as Karina built her case against Arfston, she knew she had to be careful if he found out what she was doing. There was no telling what he might do. She was walking a tightrope, and one wrong move could mean the end for her and her children. Karina's fear reached a boiling point when Arfston began to suspect that she was hiding something from him. He noticed the way she avoided his calls, the way she seemed distant and preoccupied. The trust that had once existed between them was now shattered, replaced by suspicion and paranoia. One evening, unable to take it any longer, Arfston decided to confront Karina. He showed up at her house unannounced, his mind racing with thoughts of betrayal and revenge. He had come too far to let everything fall apart now, and if Karina was planning to turn on him, he would have to stop her. When Karina opened the door and saw Arfston standing there, her heart sank. She knew that the moment of truth had arrived, and there was no escaping it. She invited him inside her mind, racing as she tried to figure out how to handle the situation. "Karina, what's going on?" Arfston demanded, his voice tense. "You've been avoiding me. I know something's up," Karina forced herself to stay calm. "Arfston, I've been dealing with a lot. Tolkien's death, the kids. It's been overwhelming," but Arfston wasn't convinced. "Don't lie to me, Karina. I know you're hiding something. If you've been talking to the police before." Karina could respond. The sound of a car pulling up outside interrupted them. She glanced out the window and saw a police cruiser parked in front of the house. Her heart skipped a beat. Had someone called the police? Panic surged through Arfsten. He stabbed Karina by the arm, his grip tight and painful. "What did you do?" He hissed, his eyes wild with fear and anger. Karina's mind raced. She knew that if she didn't act quickly, things could spiral out of control. "Arfsten, let me go," she said, her voice shaking. "The police are here. If you hurt me, they'll know." But Arfsten was beyond reason. His fear of being caught had pushed him to the edge, and he was willing to do whatever it took to protect himself. As the police officers approached the front door, Arfsten made a split-second decision, one that would have deadly consequences, in a desperate bid to escape. Arfsten pulled Karina towards the back door, his mind in a frenzy. He couldn't let the police find him here. He couldn't go to jail. But Karina resisted pulling away from him with all her strength. "Let me go." "Arfsten," she screamed, but her cries only fueled his desperation. As they struggled, Arfsten's hand tightened around her throat, cutting off her breath. Karina's vision blurred as she fought to free herself, but Arfsten's grip was too strong. She could feel herself slipping away, the life draining from her body. But just as she was about to lose consciousness, the front door burst open and the police stormed in. They had been tipped off by Karen's sister, who had grown concerned when she hadn't heard from her. The officers quickly assessed the situation and shouted at Arfsten to release Karina in a moment of blind panic. Arfsten made one final terrible decision. He released Karina, but instead of surrendering, he reached for a knife on the kitchen counter. The police, seeing the weapon, had no choice but to open fire. The gunshots echoed through the house, and Arfsten fell to the floor, the knife clattering from his hand. Karina, gasping for breath, collapsed to the ground as the officers rushed to her side. Arfsten lay, dying, his life slipping away, along with any chance of redemption. The police quickly secured the scene, and paramedics were called to attend to Karina, who was shaken but alive, as she sat on the floor, dazed and in shock. Karina couldn't believe what had just happened. The man she had once loved, the man who had destroyed her life, was now dead. The nightmare was finally over, but the scars it left behind would never fully heal. In the weeks that followed, Karina struggled to come to terms with everything that had happened. The affair, the murders, the lies. It all seemed like a terrible dream, one that she couldn't wake up from. But the reality was all too real, and she knew that she would have to live with the consequences of her actions for the rest of her life. The police investigation concluded that Arfsten had been responsible for Tolkien's and Karen's murders, and Karina was cleared of any wrongdoing. But the guilt she felt was overwhelming. She had been complicit in the affair that had ultimately led to these tragic events, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was partially to blame. Karina decided to move away from the town, found that had been the backdrop to so much pain and suffering. She needed a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life and find some semblance of peace. She took her children and relocated to a small town, far from the memories of her old life. But no matter where she went, the past followed her. The guilt, the shame, the memories of the people she had lost, they haunted her every day. She sought therapy, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. But the road to healing was long and difficult. As the years passed, Karina slowly began to rebuild her life. She focused on her children, determined to give them the stability and love that they needed. She found a new job, made new friends, and started to create a new life for herself. But the events of that fateful night would forever be etched in her mind. The affair that had started with a spark of passion had ended in unimaginable tragedy, leaving a trail of broken lives in its wake. Karina knew that she could never undo thanks for watching true crime cases.